Représentante belge à la Cour des comptes européenne. Aujourd'hui, nous continuons notre petit tour d'horizon de nos institutions avec Madame Aurélie, la médiatrice européenne, que je remercie chaleureusement pour sa présence, non pas à Bruxelles, mais à Strasbourg, et donc présente parmi nous via Zoom. Voilà, je vous aperçois à l'écran maintenant. Les activités du service du médiateur européen dont Madame Aurélie va nous exposer le rapport annuel 2019 comporte deux volets. D'abord, il y a des plaintes. J'ai vu qu'il y avait plus de 2000 plaintes arrivées pendant cette période. Elles proviennent de tous les secteurs de l'Union européenne et doivent obligatoirement avoir trait à l'une ou l'autre disposition européenne. Ensuite, il y a des enquêtes menées, environ 450 enquêtes qui sont menées, soit issues de plaintes, soit initiées de la propre initiative. J'apprends que la Belgique est un des clients réguliers, voire très réguliers, de votre office, Madame Aurélie. Je suis sûre que vous nous expliquerez les raisons. J'espère aussi que vous pourrez nous confirmer que la collaboration avec nos médiateurs fédéraux, dont par ailleurs les bureaux se trouvent dans notre édifice, est excellente, ce que je ne doute pas. Et comme vous l'indiquez dans votre préface, il est essentiel de garantir un soutien constant entre un Parlement et ses médiateurs au service des citoyens. Il s'agit d'une tâche qui me tient vraiment à cœur également. Enfin, j'ai cru comprendre que Mme Aurélie a déjà l'intention de nous lever un coin du voile pour les résultats 2020, et c'est donc avec plaisir, Madame la médiatrice, que je vous cède la parole. You have the floor. We don't hear.
Vous m'entendez maintenant?
Voilà, nous vous entendons. Voilà, nous vous entendons.
Merci beaucoup de cette chaleureuse introduction. Je suis très contente d'avoir l'opportunité cet après-midi à parler, à discuter avec vous et à présenter mon office. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about the office. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you not so much. So I'm going to take you through the work that we do, and particularly the work that we have been doing during this past year during the COVID pandemic. So I think we do have a PowerPoint presentation, some slides. Am I right? Okay, yes, so that is what we do, the European Ombudsman for a transparent, ethical and accountable EU administration, which is exactly what most of the ombudsmen, including what the Belgian ombudsman do, and that is their raison d'etre. Next slide, please.
It seems it doesn't work. There is a small problem, says the secretary.
Okay, well, if it doesn't work, I can continue anyway. Would you like me to continue or?
Yes, please continue. We shall try to resolve the problem. Yes.
Okay, well, just a small piece about the history of the office. The office was created, established by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and the first ombudsman began working in 1995. So the reason it was created was because, as you know, the Maastricht Treaty created the idea of the European citizen, and just as virtually every citizen in the member states has the opportunity to take complaints or to complain, yes, there we go, against the administration, it was thought that European citizens created following the Maastricht Treaty should have the possibility of making complaints against the European administration to a European ombudsman. So the office is now just over 25 years old. I'm the third ombudswoman, mediatrice. The first ombudsman had been the former Finnish ombudsman, The second one, my immediate predecessor, had been the Greek Ombudsman, and I was formerly the Irish Ombudsman. We are a small office. I call us the small office with a very big mandate. We have 70 staff between Brussels and Strasbourg, which is the seat of the office, as it is the seat of the European Parliament, to which I report. We handle individual complaints. We get them from citizens, from politicians, from NGOs, from businesses, anybody who has contact with the European administration. So as well as dealing with individual complaints, I also have the power of own initiative, which means that if I judge that there is a systemic problem or a particular problem in the EU administration, but which I may not have got a direct complaint about, then I can open an investigation on my own initiative and try and resolve it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we handled just over 2,000 complaints in 2020, and we opened inquiries in 370 of those. Now, a lot of the complaints that we get, understandably, actually have to do with the member state administration, but we help everybody who comes to us, and so we would direct them to the Ombudsman or to another agency that may be in a position to help them. But the bottom line is that we help everybody who comes to us. So in 2020, we opened a total of 370 inquiries. Some of them would have been own initiative or systemic investigations. Next slide, please. All right, not too surprisingly, the majority of complaints are against the Commission, not because it is a poor administrator, not at all, but simply because of the significant and powerful executive role that it has within the European administration. And then you have some of the other agencies, EPSO there, which is the European Personnel Selection Office, which basically recruits staff into the EU administration. And staff have the right to complain to the office if they feel they haven't been treated fairly or if they feel a competition was unfair. The European External Action Service is another one, OLAF, and then a lot of the regulatory agencies, the European Medicines Agency, for example, the European Chemicals Agency, or the European Food and Safety Agency. Also Frontex, which is the agency that protects the external borders of the Union. We also get complaints in relation to that. So basically all of the bodies, agencies and institutions of the office come under my, of the administration, the EU administration come under my remit. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, country statistics. As you can see, most complaints come from Spain. That tends to be the same figure every year. Not because it is a country that complains a lot, but because it is a big member state, obviously, and they also have a very highly evolved system of regional ombudsmen in addition to the national ombudsman, and so they're very familiar with the institution and therefore do send complaints to us about all sorts of issues. Some of them are political, we can't deal with them. Others have got to do with the environment and other issues like that, infringement cases and so on. Most inquiries, that is the complaints that we actually deal with, that are within our mandate and that we deal with, come from Belgium. Not too surprisingly, because that's where the institutions are. It's also where a lot of global industries have set up offices in order to lobby and to try and influence European legislation. And it's also where a lot of NGOs, civil society organizations and associations are also based. So it's not too surprising that we do get a lot of valid complaints from Belgium. Next slide, please. Right, the strategic work. So these are some of the areas that we have been dealing with. And the reason why we focus a lot on strategic work is that, as you see, and as you can see from those statistics, the vast majority of citizens' complaints, whether it's in Belgium or Ireland or anywhere else, are dealt with at local level, at national level, at member state level. So in order to make the office more useful and more relevant for everybody, I choose to do quite a lot of strategic work, which means that if I resolve a particular issue, then the benefits of that can be felt by many citizens, even if they don't have the need directly to contact the office themselves or have a particular complaint against the EU administration. So these are some of the issues we've been dealing with: revolving doors, people moving from the institutions into the private sector and vice versa. Of course, it is the right to do that. It's whether it is managed properly so that the public interest is protected, conflicts of interests. There are over 800 expert groups who advise the Commission on all sorts of issues. And the issue there was making sure that there is balance in terms of public interests, private interests, geographic balance, gender balance, and so on. Transparent lawmaking, that has been quite a significant part of our strategic work since I was elected in 2013. And this is basically giving life to the treaty right of every citizen to take part in the democratic life of the Union. Of course, one can only take part in the democratic life of the Union if you know what's going on in the first place. So we have focused on the transparency of EU lawmaking. Trilogues, as you know, are the informal but much used negotiating practice or process between the Parliament, the Commission who proposes a regulation, and the Council. The Council and the Parliament, as you know, are the co-legislators. But they're quite opaque, and our work has had to do with very simple things like, telling people that they're actually happening, who's taking part, what they involve, and then trying to keep people updated on progress as the negotiations continue. Trade negotiations, we started doing that work back in 2014 when the TTIP negotiations, that is the big trade negotiations between the EU and the US, were ongoing at the time. There were a lot of complaints to the Commission and to ourselves in relation to the lack of transparency, that people couldn't quite see what was going on and what deals were being made. The Council work, which the Parliament is very open. We know the Commission's views on issues because they're proposing the regulations, but the Council tends to be quite secretive, shall we say. Lobbying transparency, another big piece, because the EU is effectively a global regulator. And so many global corporations and others come to Brussels either directly or employ people to lobby on their behalf in order to try and make sure that the regulations favour their particular companies, their particular sector of business. Again, perfectly legitimate. Everybody has a right to influence legislation, but the issue is whether that lobbying is appropriately done and whether it is transparent. Fundamental rights, we've done a lot of work with Frontex, the border agency. And I think that work is possibly going to intensify because, as you know, the mandate of Frontex and the resources of Frontex have been significantly increased over the last while. Shortly they're going to have a total of 10,000 border guards. Some of them will be armed. So you can understand concerns about fundamental rights issues in relation to that. Next slide, please. All right, so these are an example of complaints we have got. Now, these are not uninitiative investigations. These were complaints that we got from individuals. So the first one, which I'm sure it's a subject that is very close to all of your hearts, I would imagine, it's the transparency of the COVID-19 vaccine procurement. At the beginning, the Commission, I think, was slightly reluctant to publish these the vaccine contracts, claiming commercial sensitivity and all of that. But then, as you will recall, a dispute arose between the Commission and the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca in relation to supply, and that led the Commission to itself become more proactively transparent. So I think a lot of those vaccine contracts have now been published, but we're still looking at them to see if anything that should be published has not yet been. Commission contract award to BlackRock. BlackRock, as you know, is a huge global company. I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investment company in the world. And the complaint related to a decision by the Commission to award a contract to BlackRock in relation to the development of sustainable banking regulations. And the complaint was that BlackRock had a conflict of interest because a lot of its clients were investing in non-sustainable fuels, and that there were concerns that its conflict of interest made it an unsuitable company to do that particular piece of work, which is part of the huge package that the Commission has in relation to its climate policies. So we examined that, and we concluded that while there hadn't been maladministration in that the people in the Commission who had been deciding who to award the contract to had acted within the rules, but we found there was a problem with the rules. They very narrowly defined conflict of interest. So we suggested to the Commission that they go to the legislators and suggest that they need to take a look at the rules again, and I think they are considering that, and there is some progress in relation to that particular case. This was another big case we dealt with, the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, a huge trade agreement between the EU and a number of South American states, which has been going on for a very long time, as you know. The Commission had failed, as it was supposed to. It was supposed to finish the sustainability impact assessment, which shows basically what is the impact of this trade deal on the environment and on people's lives and so on. It had concluded the negotiation of the agreement, but it hadn't concluded that. So we said that we concluded that it was maladministration, and now the Commission is in the process of concluding that impact assessment, even though the trade agreement is now out for ratification from all of the member state parliaments and indeed the European Parliament itself. Another complaint related to how the Commission verifies respect for fundamental rights of border operations linked to the use of EU funds. In Croatia, you may have read that there have been allegations of pushbacks at the Croatian border with Bosnia and I think with Serbia. Now, as European Ombudsman, I don't look at what the member state is doing. I look only at what the EU administration is doing in relation to it. So an amount of money had been given by the Commission to the authorities in Croatia in order to support the respect for fundamental rights of border operations. So that's the kind of the narrow issue that we are looking at the moment. Next slide, please. Right, this was revolving doors is quite a big issue, obviously not just in the EU, but in other member states as well. And there can be different, shall we say, cultural attitudes in relation to it. You may know there's quite a big scandal happening at the moment in the UK in relation to this sort of lobbying and revolving door matter. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Anyway, this was a complaint from a finance watchdog, a civil society group, about the fact that the former executive director of the European Banking Authority had been allowed to take up a post with major financial sector lobby organizations. We found unambiguously that the European Banking Authority should have prohibited the move because there was a clear risk of conflict of interest. The administrations tend to be very reluctant to actually stop somebody doing it, but they do have the power to do so. So I made recommendations in relation to how to tighten the rules on post-employment screening and restrictions. And in September of last year, the European Banking Authority agreed to implement them. And of course, it's not just the EBA. We hope that those rules and that issue will be taken up right across the EU administration, because it actually comes down to a matter of trust. If you want citizens to trust you, you have to behave at a very, at the appropriate level and to set a good example. All right, the next slide, please. Right, so obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March of last year, we strategized in relation to how we could be most useful in relation to this crisis. We didn't know whether our complaint numbers were going to go up or down. In general, they remained the same. But we set out, we published a series of own initiative inquiries, which had to do with, a lot had to do with the transparency of the administration, because obviously everybody was pushed into a different way of working. They were at home, there wasn't the same interaction, but we wanted to make sure that there was the same levels of accountability and transparency, and that you know, institutions weren't hiding behind the pandemic in order to pass decisions without the public, without citizens being able to see them and have a say in them. So we looked at the transparency of emergency decision making in the Council. We looked at the European Medicines Agency and how it was approving medicines and treatments linked to COVID-19. And we looked at the Commission in relation to public procurement, scientific advice and lobbying. And we looked at the EIB and the transparency of the terms and criteria related to new financing measures for small and medium enterprises. Now, some of those have concluded, some of them were still awaiting responses, but it was important for us to highlight the issue, that it was particularly important during a time of pandemic that the administration be acting as openly as possible, because as you know, in your country and in every country, people are fearful, people are scared, and they want to know what their governments are doing, what the EU administration is doing, and they want to know that they can trust it. So therefore, even if it is more complicated or more complex in times like this, it is absolutely vital that the decision making and all of this is done as openly and as transparently as possible. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so this was one of the big investigations that we did. The ECDC is the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, a relatively new agency. It was created after the SARS epidemic in 2003-2004, which actually affected very few people in Europe. And when I say very few, I mean 30 in total. One person sadly died. But obviously, compared to what happened subsequently, it was a relatively minor event. But in any event, it enabled the powers that be to create the European Centre for Disease Control. And the idea was that it would act as a hub, sort of a coordinating centre for all of the member states, so that when a crisis happened, that the member states would be prepared. Well, I'm sure you all have your own views to the extent of the preparedness of the member states and the EU generally in relation to that. But what we found really was that the ECDC is a relatively powerless institution. It has a big, important title, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, but in fact, it lacks independence of action, so that if it wanted to find out over the last number of years, or indeed now when the pandemic started, you know, how many ICU beds Ireland had, or how much PPE Belgium had, or what the state of the health system was in Croatia, it couldn't go in independently and find out. It had to rely on the member states to give them the information. And so there was, when looking back at records and so on, we saw that there was quite a lot of reluctance on the part of the member states, not necessarily to hand over information, but to have it published, so that they didn't want to be part of a sort of a league table and be embarrassed because their health service was not as prepared as others. So naturally, when the pandemic happened, the ECDC was not in a position to coordinate in a way that might have mitigated at least some of the impact of the pandemic. So in my inquiry, I set out a number of suggestions in relation to transparency, collaboration, and so on. But I basically pointed out that it's for legislators ultimately to decide the future of the ECDC. As you know, health is a member state competence, not an EU competence. So pretty shortly after the pandemic started, you heard the Commission talking about that the EU needed to create a stronger health union. Those are political matters, but I did make the point that unless the ECDC's mandate is significantly expanded, i.e. if it is given the independence, which theoretically you could argue it can't have now, given that health competence is a matter for the member states, then it will continue as it has. Okay, next slide, please. Right, council accountability. We've been doing this work now for a number of years, partly arising from complaints and partly arising from our own views and those of others in relation to the transparency of the council. So we did a big, almost a forensic analysis of the council a few years ago. The permanent representatives, the ambassadors from all of our countries who come together, and also the working parties, the 150 working parties, which comprise civil servants again from all of the member states. And we looked at issues like transparency, and we found that there were two ways in which the council kept itself non-transparent. One was by stamping limité, or secret, on virtually every document, documents which really should have been easily accessible to the public. but also by not recording the positions taken by the member states. So our recommendations was to examine every document is to see whether limité was an appropriate designation for them, but also to at least record the member states' positions, not necessarily to publish them, because one has to recognize there has to be room for debate and argument and so on, and every good transparency regime recognizes that, but that they should at least be published. So when the Council didn't respond appropriately, I took a report to the European Parliament, which is the only report apart from one I took earlier on Frontex that I made to the Parliament. They overwhelmingly accepted my recommendations, as did a number of member state parliaments, including the Belgian Parliament, in promoting more transparency at Council level. And I suppose the way I sort of talked about this was, we all know the tendency to blame Brussels, blame the EU administration, and that was a huge factor, of course, in the UK referendum, and it's also a factor in member states as well. And part of our reasoning was to allow citizens to see the role that their own member states play in devising legislation. That is not the faceless bureaucrats of the Commission who do this. Ultimately, the people who sign off and agree legislation which affects all of the citizens are the members of the Council, the member states, and the Parliament, who are elected by the people themselves. So some small improvements have been made. It's a slow process because this is really a cultural shift, because the Council works, or a lot of them do, in this sort of a diplomatic prism and doesn't fully engage with its legislative role. But we've seen some small steps. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this was another complaint. As you know, when a member state takes on the 6-month rotating presidency of the EU, a lot of them do get sponsorship, because it can be expensive to do that with all the meetings and hospitality and so on, or at least it used to be before COVID. So we got a complaint about a specific presidency, but we didn't look at that. We looked into the general issue of sponsorship. So we concluded that the Council should draw up guidelines in relation to that, to make sure that people don't feel that the companies that do sponsor have an undue access or influence over EU policy making. Now, initially, the Council had refused to accept that it had any role. It said it was completely for. It was a matter for the member states and not for them, but it changed its view. It accepted that when people see EU Council, they think Council, and it is in fact the Council that runs these. So a number of presidencies, the German presidency did not accept the sponsorship, but of course you could argue, well, a lot of member states are very well off anyway, so they don't need to. But again, it wasn't that we suggested they be banned, but that guidelines be introduced. And you can see there's still a lot of arguments in relation to those draft guidelines, so that's a work in progress. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and this is the network of ombudsmen, which I have the honour to chair, almost 100 offices across Europe, regionals, the accession countries, Iceland as well, Switzerland, including the 2 Belgian federal ombudsmen and the regional ombudsman, the ombudswoman of the German-speaking community, who are great colleagues. And basically, it's for exchanging information. I remember when I was Irish ombudsman, I would often, well, quite frequently, write to the European ombudsman if I got a complaint which had an EU element to it and needed advice, and the office would always be very helpful. Members exchange, information and advice on all sorts of topics, and then once a year we get together and have a seminar. We pick particular issues which are most relevant to the offices and discuss those. Recently, we had a webinar with members of staff of some of the offices in relation to artificial intelligence and public administration, and that was quite an interesting conversation. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Okay, so that's an overview of the work that we do. It's quite broad, as you can see, and thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup, Madame la médiatrice, pour cet exposé dense. Je ne doute pas que les parlementaires ont des questions à vous faire parvenir. Ja, ik zie dat mevrouw Van Bossuit vraagt het woord. Ja, mevrouw Van Bossuit.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Thank you very much, Mrs. O'Reilly. I will speak in my mother tongue, so I don't know if you have translation available.
I actually don't know either. I'm not sure where I'm.
But then I will do it. Then I will do it in English, no problem. If that's
you're very
more difficult for no problem, no problem. So thank you very much for giving us all this this information. Thank you very much for all the work you do. I very much appreciate and also have a lot of respect for the work that you are doing. In the former legislature, I was a member of European Parliament, and I was always very interested in the work that you are doing, because I think that what an ombudsman is doing reflects a lot of what people think about Europe, or where the issues are. So I think that taking into account your report and what you are doing brings Europe closer to its citizens. If we can resolve these issues, then other things or activities that Europe is doing. So thank you very much for all the work that you and your team that you were also of 70 people, I think you said, are doing. So thank you very much. I had a question on what you are doing on COVID, because the report that we received, it was made before the whole pandemic started, but you have already answered a lot of these questions I had. I have also another question, and that is what what is the relationship between your service on the one hand, and then the other European institutions that exist for complaints. And then I think, for example, about the European consumer centers that we have in every country, or Solvit, for example. Are citizens aware of the differences and of the different possibilities that exist for taking into account complaints? So that's one question. Then maybe more in general, because you mentioned on COVID-19 the lack of transparency, or maybe more the questions that you received on the procurement of the vaccines. Is it a general impression that you have that because you say that transparent EU administration is one of your three main topics, that with COVID-19 that we have more concerns about this lack of transparency that we have that we had before, or that we had before? So that's also a question. And do you see maybe a mind shift because of the experience that we have now with COVID-19? And then a last question is on your mandate itself. You receive a lot of complaints. Do you think that your mandate is broad enough to take into account these complaints, or do you think that there should be other policies or other things that should be changed in your mandate? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Chair, would you like me to answer?
Thank you very much. Mrs. O'Reilly, you can have access to English interpretation. You have a button in the lower side of your screen. On the right, I think, you can see interpretation. And you can choose different languages: French, Dutch, English.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing this. I might get one of my colleagues to come in. Aidan, if you're listening to this, you might ask one of the colleagues to come in and find this. I don't immediately see it. Apologies for that.
Yes, yes. Normally you should see this button. Yes.
Okay. Shall I answer that question while I...
Yes, we shall first have all the questions. Yes. Mevrouw Samin?
Ja. Dank u, mevrouw de voorzitter. I also do my intervention in English. So also from my side, thank you for all the hard work and for you and your team that you are doing. I will just stick to the questions. I have like 2 questions for you. How does the collaboration with the regional ombudsman work? Flanders, for example, do you have like direct collaboration with the regions, or does it go via the federal ombudsman? And then I read in the end you will report that you encouraged the European Commission to step up its monitoring of complaints mechanism, to pay attention to how it deals directly with complaints and to make best use of its powers to address problems with complaints mechanism in member states. Yeah, can you clarify that, and if possible, maybe with an example? I will stick to the 2 questions. It's a bit difficult to translate it all from English to from Dutch to English, but anyway, your presentation was very clear, so I had a lot of my question already answered, so thanks a lot anyway.
Dank u wel, mevrouw Samin. Pour le MR, monsieur de Maagd. Vous avez la parole, monsieur de Maagd.
Merci Madame la Présidente, et je voudrais également au nom de mon groupe le Mouvement Réformateur remercier Madame Aurélie pour sa présentation. Vous êtes évidemment l'émanation de la voix du citoyen européen auprès des différentes instances européennes, et donc c'est fondamental, vous avez un rôle fondamental. Peut-être une remarque, alors vous avez évoqué certaines affaires que vous suivez de manière très attentive. J'ai retenu qu'il y avait eu 310 enquêtes suite aux 2000 plaintes déposées en 2020, ce qui n'est pas rien. Dont 210 qui émanent à la Commission. Alors d'abord une remarque sur la transparence du processus législatif européen qui est essentielle évidemment pour assurer une pleine et entière confiance et adhésion des citoyens dans le projet européen. Il est pour nous essentiel que les citoyens puissent avoir accès aux informations liées au processus législatif et aux décisions des institutions et des organes qui émanent de l'Europe. Je pense notamment aux positions défendues par les différents pays, par le biais de représentants élus, que ce soit directement ou par leur gouvernement au sein du Conseil de l'Union européenne. Alors le médiateur européen a également pour rôle d'attirer l'attention sur le droit des citoyens d'être associés au processus démocratique de l'Union européenne. Est-ce que vous allez, Madame Aurélie, et votre office, être associés au bon déroulement de la conférence sur l'avenir de l'Europe? La crise du Covid-19, vous l'avez évoqué, hein, vous avez notamment parlé de cette attention particulière sur la transparence des marchés publics liés au vaccin Covid-19, et c'est une très bonne décision et c'est très important. Par rapport à cette crise du Covid-19, est-ce que selon vous et vos équipes, elle a augmenté le nombre de plaintes liées à la transparence des processus décisionnels, notamment l'accès aux informations et documents liés aux débats, aux décisions prises par les différentes institutions de l'Union européenne, en ce compris bien entendu la vaccination, mais ça c'est un autre problème je pense. Dans quelle mesure les propositions du médiateur européen aux institutions et aux organes de l'Union sur la manière d'aborder différents problèmes et d'améliorer leurs pratiques sont-elles suivies des faits? Vos propositions, si je ne me trompe, si je ne m'abuse, ne sont pas des propositions contraignantes. Et donc, de quels incitants, de quels outils disposez-vous pour assurer une meilleure application possible de vos recommandations? Ce sera ma dernière question. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur de Maagd. Ceci clôture les questions. It ends our questioning. Mrs. Aurélie, should you be able to answer now?
Yes, thank you. In relation to other complaint handling entities within the EU, the consumer associations that were mentioned, Solvit, and of course there is the Petitions Committee, of the European Parliament, which deals with complaints as well. Where we make the distinction is that I deal solely with complaints against the European administration, whereas, of course, the Petty Committee deals with cross-border issues, member state issues, infringement cases, and so on. So there's never any confusion between ourselves and the Petty Committee. In relation to the other bodies that were mentioned, we have dialogues with them, and also quite often, if a complaint was not within our mandate, we would suggest that they go to Solvit or one of the consumer bodies. So as I say, everybody is always helped, and those are some of the bodies to whom we would direct complaints. Yes, in relation to the mind shift, I think, as the Deputy put it, in relation to transparency, I hope there will have been. I mean, I found it quite interesting that in relation to the vaccine contracts, I think the predisposition initially of the Commission was to focus on issues around commercial confidentiality and so on, and not on the wider public interest. Of course, they are legitimate exemptions, but many of them, most of them, have to be analysed vis-a-vis whether there is a greater public interest in disclosure. And then when the dispute happened between the Commission and AstraZeneca, suddenly the Commission was talking about transparency and the need for transparency, and they talked with AstraZeneca, and the contract was published or partly published, and that is it. So, you know, there was a mind shift there, but it was a mind shift partly prompted by a political problem that the Commission had, essentially, in relation to AstraZeneca, and they felt it would be useful to have greater transparency in order to help resolve that problem. But I think on a wider level, I mean, every day in all of our countries, we are reading about everything from, you know, people not understanding certain decisions that are made in relation to lockdowns or other COVID measures, some expressions of vaccine hesitancy, all of that. And really what people are is frightened, and probably all of us are to a certain degree, and they're looking for the assurance. It's not quite, I don't want to, you know, sort of trivialize it by saying it's children looking to their parents for reassurance, but there's an element of that in it. And therefore, in order for governments to get acceptance for the measures that they have, assuming they are good measures, of course, it needs people to trust them. And the way people trust them is if they know that if they know what's going on, and if they know that things are transparent and open to the greatest extent possible, and that nothing has been hidden from them. And that's why there is a huge interest in increasing and maintaining levels of transparency. And I hope it does continue once this ends. In relation to the regional ombudsman, yes, certainly the regional ombudsman are part of the network. We collaborate with them. They come to the network events, and of course, some of the regional ombudsmen are in charge of regions which are bigger in many cases than entire countries, including my own. So they have a huge role. We don't make a distinction between the two. In relation to, I didn't quite follow the complaint mechanism question. I know if it was related to Frontex, that has been an issue. There is a complaint mechanism within Frontex. We're examining at the moment to see whether people are aware of it or whether it's used and what happens when it is used. So we'll be coming out with results in relation to that, hopefully quite soon. On the Conference of the Future of Europe, I mean, I think we don't have a direct role in it. We would hope to have an observer role, obviously, and even if we don't, we'll be observing it anyway, because this is about citizens. And the Ombudsman institution was set up initially the reason it was set up partly was to act as that bridge between the European administration and the citizens. So I think people will be looking at it very closely. As you know, it didn't get off to a great start, where there was arguments about who should preside over it, and in the end they decided they would have not one person presiding over it, but three. But if it goes ahead and it's smooth, then I'm sure people won't worry too much about that. I think where it will get interesting, obviously, is you know, when the extent to which it really does engage with citizens and not just pay lip service to them, and the extent to which then people's views are taken on board and something concrete comes out of it. But those are political matters. My concern is that if we have something to contribute, then we will. In relation to the number of complaints and whether COVID increased that, I don't think it increased it, but I sense that what COVID has done has sensitized people much more to the actions of the European administration. And therefore people are looking much more closely on it, because they know that the way out of this is not just being decided or managed by their own member states, but it is also, to a degree, being managed by the actions of the European Union. And of course, many good things have been done, enabling people to get money, even if they lose their jobs, if their businesses have to close and so on. And many actions were taken very rapidly by the European administration at the start to make sure that people didn't suffer too much. Everybody has suffered, of course, but I think there has been generally a good welcome for that. But also in relation to the vaccine rollout and other matters, people are seeing that the EU is playing a huge role, perhaps a bigger role than they had imagined before this began. And so therefore, my work and the work that you're doing at the moment is hugely important. And I know I've repeated this over the last while, but again, trust makes things work. You know, it's something, it's almost like a cliche. We throw it out, well, people need to have trust in government. But this has real life or death implications now in relation to the pandemic, because if people don't trust, they won't take certain actions, or they will engage in other actions, and there will be consequences for that. So that's why I believe it's never been more important than at this particular challenging period of time that the EU administration, indeed all administrations, be as open as possible with their citizens. People can take bad news. What they can't take is the stress of thinking that they're not getting the full story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mevrouw van Bossuit. Ja, een repliek.
Yeah, dank u wel, voorzitter. Thank you very much, Mrs. O'Reilly, for your answers. I have one more question, if I may. It's because you were mentioning the importance of trust, and I think that's true. But it's very much linked, I think, to communication. And that's also something where I think the EU is lacking for the moment with the pandemic. If you take, for example, the communication on the AstraZeneca vaccine, then you see that I was speaking to a doctor this morning, and even he doesn't know anymore for which age you can or you can't give the AstraZeneca. So I think also the communication is very important. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Sorry, will I reply now? Yes.
Perhaps shall we have all the answers? Mevrouw Samin, geen antwoord. Monsieur de Maagd.
Oui, merci Madame la Présidente et merci Madame Aurélie pour vos réponses. Juste, je ne pense pas avoir reçu de réponse sur ma dernière question qui a trait au suivi des recommandations que vous faites en tant que médiatrice européenne ou que votre service fait. Quels seraient les incitants, vos recommandations n'étant pas contraignantes auprès des différentes institutions, quels seraient les incitants dont vous pourriez disposer pour qu'elles entraînent une meilleure application sur le terrain de vos recommandations? Ce serait un écho que j'aimerais entendre de votre part. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur de Maagd. Mrs. O'Reilly, for your answers.
Thank you. Yes, one cannot deny that there is citizen confusion in relation to many things, and there has been a lot of citizen confusion in relation to the different vaccines, I suppose, particularly in relation to AstraZeneca. Every country, of course, is not bound by, member states are not bound by the recommendations of the European Medicines Agency. They can independently make their own rules and recommendations in relation to the take-up of vaccines. I know in many countries they have put particular age limits, then they've changed it. 1 minute it's under 60s and it's over 60s, it's under 70s, it's over 70s. And, you know, I know in Ireland at the moment they are confining the uptake of AstraZeneca just to the 60 to 69-year-olds. So obviously some people in that bracket are wondering, well, you know, why us? And people in other age brackets who would happily take AstraZeneca are saying, well, why not us? But the thing is that there is no simple answer to this, because they haven't yet tracked down specifically what is in any vaccine that is causing particular side effects. So in a way, to an extent, it's a guessing game. You know, for example, you know, women seem to be worse affected in terms of those very bad side effects than men. But then could that be simply because an awful lot of health workers have been immunized, have got the vaccine early, and therefore there are more women in that area? You think of nurses and care workers and so on. Are there particular underlying conditions? I mean, who knows? So in a way, governments are having to, I won't say take a chance, but they're doing their best I really believe to get all the advice and to make decisions accordingly. But again, when they change their minds, people are understandably nervous. So that is something that I think will continue for a while. In relation to the recommendations, yes, I don't make binding decisions, as you say. I'm not a judge. The vast majority of my recommendations are accepted, and my suggestions are accepted as well. I think that should be the case because in any well-functioning, sign of any well-functioning democracy, where there is adherence to the rule of law and respect for the rule of law, an ombudsman's recommendations should be accepted unless they are completely crazy. I suppose where I get some pushback is in relation to transparency. I mean, I talked earlier about council transparency, and I talked in particular about the fact that member states' positions are not recorded. So that seems like an abstract idea, but actually in two particular cases, it had a significant impact. One related to advice that had been given to the council about pesticides and bees. So which are going to harm the bees, which aren't, and so on, and advice as to how certain pesticides should best be used in the member states. That has stayed stuck at council level for the last almost 8 years. And nobody knows why it is being stuck. And the reason it's been stuck, obviously, is because certain member states want to do different things. But the civil society or others, Belgian Parliament, can't really get involved if they don't know who is responsible. And that's what I mean about the failure to really give full expression to a citizen's right to take part in the democratic life of the Union if they don't know what's going on or what's blocking something. So when the member states' positions were looked for, the Commission, who held them, slightly complicated, said no. Came to us. The Commission came back to us and said that they judged that there was a greater public interest in maintaining the deliberative space, if you like, the sanctity of the deliberative space, than in allowing people to know which country was taking which position. Now, I completely disagreed with that. I mean, I can understand deliberations that take 6 months, even a year, but when something goes on for 7 years, then something is being hidden. Another issue, again, where we got pushback from and did not get our recommendations accepted, even though there have been some moves since then, was in relation to the negotiations over the fishing quotas. It's famous all-night negotiations that take place over fishing quotas every year. And again, member state positions were looked in relation to that, and again, they were not released. So, that is the balance. I'm not saying I have the right answer or know exactly where the balance should be, but there is a debate, an argument about okay, where does the public interest lie in making sure that the negotiations remain private so everybody eventually can come to an agreement, or allowing the public in so that at least the public can start to influence what is happening. Wherever the balance lies, I believe that in certain instances it's not lying in the right place at this moment.
Thank you. Mevrouw Van Bossuit, heeft u nog een vraag? Nee. Mevrouw Samin ook niet. Monsieur de Maagd, voulez-vous reprendre la parole?
Merci Madame la Présidente. Non, juste remercier Madame Aurélie pour son intervention.
Merci beaucoup. So we shall thank you, Mrs. Aurélie, for your being here this afternoon for our commission. We are really happy to hear about your explanations on the functioning of your institution, on the methodology, on the subjects you have to cope with, and of all what you do in favor of European institutions, but in the first place, European citizens. So we look forward to hear from you again for the future, and if you have several advice to give to the Belgian Parliament for the conference on the future of Europe, we shall take them very, very happily. So thanks for all of us to attend our meeting, and we can finish here our debate. I thank you and hope to see you again very, very soon. Merci à tous, bedankt iedereen en tot morgen zeker. Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, au revoir.